In my video on The Dark Knight, I mentioned how a sequel can be a scary thing to attempt, and that effect is only compounded when making a trilogy. Even more so when your next entry is meant to be the definitive end to one of the most lucrative franchises in cinematic history. There are trilogies where the first entry is the best, there are others where the second is the best, and there are even some where the third is superior to its predecessors. Making a complete trilogy, where all three films are near equal in terms of quality, however, is a near impossible task. Yet that's exactly what Christopher Nolan was attempting with The Dark Knight Rises. As a kid, I watched Batman Begins and The Dark Knight countless times before finally getting to Dark Knight Rises. I had become a huge fan of the character by that point, and was extremely excited for it. However, after my first viewing, I never watched it again. Why is that? That's what we're going to find out today. Rises served as the official send-off for Christopher Nolan's time with the character of Batman. He had proven with Inception that he was a brand at this point. His name alone could draw an audience to a theater, and he was now free to tell whatever stories he liked. Despite that, he still chose to return to Gotham one last time. Clearly, he must have had some true inspiration and a clear vision in mind for the final installment in his Batman trilogy. The Dark Knight was a massive success by all metrics, so following that up may have seemed unfeasible. However, Christopher Nolan was yet to make even a mediocre movie by this point, so fans had hope. The Dark Knight Rises was one of the most widely anticipated films of the 2010s, and in July 2012, it finally released. It outperformed The Dark Knight at the box office, and initially received similar praise from critics. 13 years later, however, it's often regarded as the weakest of the trilogy. In fact, that's exactly how I felt after my first viewing years ago. Why was this the case, and has my opinion changed at all since then? Let's find out. Today we'll be taking a look at the finale to the legendary Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises. After the success of The Dark Knight, the seemingly inevitable sequel was on everyone's mind, especially considering how that narrative ended. There seems to have been a near infinite number of ways you could take this story. You could start right where we left off with Batman still being pursued, or perhaps you could show the immediate aftermath, with Bruce reminiscing about the events of that story. While the possibilities may have seemed endless, Christopher Nolan wasn't initially sure about making a third film. He agreed to work on it only if he and writer David Goyer could come up with a story that interested him. By the end of 2008, Nolan did complete a rough story outline. However, he then went off to work on Inception. In early 2010 though, Nolan and Goyer reportedly cracked the story. Soon after this, Goyer would leave the project to work on Man of Steel. Fortunately, Goyer and Nolan already had the story mostly ironed out by that point, and Jonathan Nolan soon began working on a screenplay. Taking inspiration from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, The Dark Knight Rises would be an epic, focusing on the class divide in Gotham. The first two movies threatened to turn Gotham in on itself, and with this third entry, Nolan would finally go through with that promise. Nolan had finally found a story that interested him, and the long-awaited sequel to The Dark Knight was officially underway. Thus far, the pre-production cycle mirrored The Dark Knight pretty well, so all signs seemed to point to yet another masterpiece from the Nolan brothers. Much of the same crew also returned for The Dark Knight Rises, including production designer Nathan Crowley, cinematographer Wally Pfister, and the score was once again composed by Hans Zimmer. Nolan tackled each film in his Batman trilogy as though they were unique stories rather than just sequels. This is most evident from a visual standpoint. Nathan Crowley had three major tasks when working on The Dark Knight Rises. First was the Batcave. After being teased in Batman Begins, people were obviously going to have high expectations for the iconic Batcave, and this rendition definitely delivers. The Nolan Batman movies have a habit of making alterations from their source material. However, this is a fairly traditional Batcave. The second challenge Crowley had was designing the Batcopter. This was by far the most fantastical element he had to design thus far, and he somehow had to make it fit in Nolan's grounded universe. Fortunately, The Dark Knight Rises concerns itself much less than its predecessors on remaining grounded, so this task wasn't quite as challenging as it would have been in either of the previous entries. Despite this fact, Crowley held true to the conventions of this series and approached the design from the same militaristic angle as the Tumbler or Batpod. What's also impressive is the way this design was utilized while filming. A full-scale model was actually built and mounted on a vehicle to simulate flight, with CGI only being used afterwards to remove the rigs and add details like propellers. It's frankly incredible and is yet another impressive feat in practical effects by Christopher Nolan. The third challenge Nathan Crowley had to tackle for The Dark Knight Rises was the city of Gotham itself. Gotham retained the traditional urban aesthetic from The Dark Knight. However, this time, much of the narrative takes place during the winter, with Gotham being covered in snow. While this may seem like a small change, it creates a completely distinct atmosphere from The Dark Knight. For many of the establishing shots of the city used throughout the film, different city skylines were used to create Gotham. This made the city feel bigger, which fits the larger scale of the story. Aiding in creating this effect is the use of IMAX. The first 6 minutes were shot entirely using IMAX cameras, and combined with the insanely impressive practical effects, create an unforgettable opening. It's genuinely stunning. I obviously haven't seen every movie to use IMAX cameras, but I believe that The Dark Knight Rises had the single most impressive use of IMAX up to this point. The cinematography in The Dark Knight Rises would already be notable because of just how gorgeous it is, but it also set a record with 72 minutes worth of IMAX footage, the most of any feature film up to that point. Comparatively, The Dark Knight only had about 28 minutes worth of IMAX footage, and I can't overstate how significant this is. A big draw of The Dark Knight Rises is the scale. It aims to consistently wow the audience with pure spectacle, and in large part due to these IMAX shots, it succeeds. And as always, backing up the visuals and consistently enhancing each scene is the incredible score by Hans Zimmer. While his work on Inception is still my favorite up to this point, The Dark Knight Rises is the best score in the Batman trilogy in my eyes. It brings back many of the iconic themes from the first two, with two notable additions. Firstly, Bane's theme, which incorporates the chant later in the story, which we'll get into later. And secondly, Catwoman's theme. It fits her character really well, and I love the way it comes in as Selina Kyle drops her facade in her opening scene. Speaking of Selina Kyle, we have to talk about the casting choices in The Dark Knight Rises. All of the mainstays in this series return. Obviously Christian Bale as Bruce Wayne, Gary Oldman as Jim Gordon, Morgan Freeman as Lucius Fox, and Michael Caine as Alfred Pennyworth. Although Alfred does have a slightly more limited role in Rises than he had in the previous entries, his best scene in the trilogy can be found here, that of course being the conversation in the stairwell. The way Michael Caine's voice is breaking all throughout the scene is heartbreaking. Also, that line about hearing Bruce cry as a baby really establishes to the audience just how close these characters are and how deeply Alfred cares for Bruce. And all of this obviously adds just that much more weight to the ending. Moving on to the new additions to the cast though, we have Selina Kyle played by Anne Hathaway. Anne Hathaway does a good job in the part, but unfortunately, Catwoman feels just a bit limited in this story. A lot of her character development takes place during montages, and I just don't really buy her romance with Bruce in the end. Admittedly, that is more of a script issue than an acting issue. I do love her design though. The goggles in particular are such an inspired idea. The idea that when she puts them on her head they look like cat ears was truly a stroke of genius. Another newcomer is Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, John Blake, who was later revealed to be this universe's Robin. Kind of. We'll get more into his character arc later, but I think he might be the single most misunderstood person in this story. The next major addition to the cast was Marion Cotillard, who plays Miranda Tate, or Talia al Ghul. And to be honest, this whole character is just a complete failure. From a writing standpoint, it's already a flawed concept. However, even the performance isn't very good. She's meant to be the twist villain of the story, but Marion Cotillard just plays her too evil from the beginning. From her very first appearance, it's clear that this character is a villain. Not even her first appearance, actually. Fans had guessed who Marion Cotillard was playing before the film even released. Within the story, though, the biggest problem with the character is her dialogue, with her having such subtle lines as,
"You have to invest if you want to restore balance to the world."
That's a classic villain line right there, but the performance isn't very convincing either. And all of this not to mention her death scene, which has already been discussed at length by many others. It's genuinely horrible, and one of the most embarrassing moments in Nolan's entire filmography. Yes, the performance is bad, but the fault mostly falls on the editor for using that take. Of course, there is the possibility that this was the best take they got, and if that was the case, maybe just cut the whole thing out and leave her death ambiguous? I don't know, anything is better than this.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally? You merely adopted the dark.
After the passing of Heath Ledger, it was decided that the Joker wouldn't return in any capacity. Warner Bros. Was okay with this decision, however they wanted the villain to at least be someone in a similar vein to Joker, with the Riddler being their top choice. Nolan wanted to go in a different direction though. In the prior two movies, Batman was never truly matched physically. Once the villains finally came face to face with the Caped Crusader, they were usually defeated soon after. Nolan wanted his next villain to be physically imposing, to contrast everyone who had come before him, and to push Batman to his absolute limit. These concepts are exactly what led to Bane's creation in 1993, so clearly he was the ideal candidate for this story, with Tom Hardy eventually being cast as Bane. Now aside from the race swapping, I think this actually was a pretty good casting. Tom Hardy's a phenomenal actor and brought the necessary menace to the role. Obviously he had to go through quite the physical transformation, and this performance was also made especially difficult by the mask he was required to wear. It's very different from Bane's design in the comics, but I think it fits this iteration of the character well, although I am partial to it because it bears strong resemblance to Darth Vader. Either way, due to the mask, Tom Hardy could only express emotion with his eyes, and each of his lines had to be dubbed over in post. Notably, because of this and some bad sound mixing, Bane doesn't exactly sound present within the film. His voice sounds separate from the rest of the characters. Now don't get me wrong, this is a bad thing. It undoubtedly breaks the audience's immersion. However, in my opinion, it also makes Bane far more threatening. I found myself listening very closely when he spoke because of just how jarring he was. And while we're on the topic of Bane's voice, we have to discuss the vocal performance itself. This is one of the most common talking points in The Dark Knight Rises and is one of the most hated elements of the entire trilogy. And on my first viewing, I wholeheartedly agreed with the criticism. After rewatching the movie multiple times for this video though, I'd be lying if I said the voice didn't grow on me. I honestly kinda love it now. There are some goofy line deliveries for sure.
Crashing displayed.
But for every weird line like that, there's one like this.
I didn't see the light until I was already a man. By then it was nothing to me but blinding.
I love the way he roars the word blinding. It perfectly caps off one of the best villain monologues I've ever heard. And what he accomplishes here only adds to his menace. Before we get to that though, let's set the scene for Batman and Bane's fight in the sewers. At the start of our story, Bruce is a shell of his former self. After losing Rachel, in his eyes, he lost the one chance he had for a normal life. And after effectively losing the mantle of Batman as well, Bruce is left with nothing to live for. Once both Blake and Gordon tell Bruce that the world needs Batman again, Bruce finally decides to put the cape and cowl on once again. Before he does though, he has a heartfelt conversation with Alfred, where it's made obvious that Bruce isn't ready. Alfred tries repeatedly to warn him against rushing in blindly. However, in a moment that bears much resemblance to The Dark Knight, Bruce completely underestimates his enemy, and disaster follows. This fight in the sewer is spectacular. The way the scene shifts into IMAX as the trap is sprung immediately works to increase the tension. The lack of music emphasizes the importance of this moment, and the fight choreography is the best the series had seen up to this point. On top of that, this scene contains the aforementioned monologue, and the moment where Bane breaks Batman's back is forever etched in my brain. Now, a villain sparing the hero's life is usually a tired trope, but I think it actually works here. Up to this point, Bruce has welcomed death, and Bane, recognizing this, instead decides to torture Bruce by bringing him to the pit, a prison Bane was once captive in. This scene also gives us an explanation on why Bane doesn't immediately destroy Gotham.
I learned here that there can be no true despair without hope.
He wants to give the citizens a false hope before their seemingly inevitable despair. It's the same reason why the courts later in the story offer the choice of exile. It gives the convicted one last glimmer of hope before they're ultimately plunged into despair. Of course, this is the same reason why Bane imprisoned Bruce in the pit, but it also serves to create one more parallel between the characters. For all intents and purposes, Bane and Batman are two sides of the same coin, both excellent fighters and brilliant minds trained by the League of Shadows. Another notable similarity between the two is their masks. They obviously both wear masks, but each one is also defeated as their mask is destroyed. A major difference between the two exists, however, in their reactions to the pit.
Bruce, why do we fall?
Bane never escaped from the pit. Eventually, after allowing Talia to escape, she came back for him along with Ra's al Ghul. Bruce, on the other hand, is determined to rise from the pit, and I love this entire sequence. It feels like a short film within the film, and is the strongest bit of the narrative by far. The callbacks to Bruce falling down the well in Batman Begins add a layer of nuance that isn't common in the superhero genre. The idea that Bruce has been essentially trapped in a pit since his parents' death is powerful. In Batman Begins, he supposedly conquered his fears, however that wasn't the end of his journey with the concept. In The Dark Knight, he gained a new fear, a fear of the unknowable, and in Rises, he must learn to fear death once again, or in other words, gain the will to live. There's an excellent line where an inmate tells Bruce that fear will find him if he climbs without the rope. Right on cue, a swarm of bats rush past him as he attempts to make the climb. These bats, representing his original fear, found him to give him the determination needed to finally rise from the pit. This pit symbolizing not only him rising above everything he faced in this narrative, but also finally moving past all the repressed emotions from his parents' death. It's this sequence that makes the ending feel earned. And in my eyes, it's the greatest scene in the entire trilogy. The way the music swells, the callbacks, the powerful chant, and the pure catharsis present in this scene is unmatched. It truly feels like the culmination of 2.5 films and properly prepares the audience for the intense and monumental final act. The visuals are incredible, the set pieces are noteworthy, and the final fight versus Bane is immensely gratifying as an audience. So far, The Dark Knight Rises may seem like a masterpiece. Sure, I brought out small issues here and there, but for the most part, it seems like a sound narrative. However, that isn't the case, unfortunately. The Dark Knight Rises isn't a fundamentally flawed story. A simple plot synopsis may make it sound like an inevitable classic, and the visuals would seem to support this claim. However, Rises ends up being a case of death by 1,000 cuts. There isn't one big issue that tears the structure down, but rather many small cracks that eventually topple the entire thing. Of course, there is the aforementioned issues like Catwoman's lackluster portrayal, Bane's odd sound mixing, and his inconsistent voice in general. However, the largest of these issues is Talia al Ghul. I briefly touched on it earlier, but seriously, this was such a misstep narratively. I'm not a fan of twist villains in the first place, but when the villain is barely hidden to begin with, and also isn't given any real depth, it's made even worse. It also doesn't help that Bane was actually a very interesting character up to this point, and he's unceremoniously dispatched in less than a second. I seriously think that Bane's death is the worst moment in the entire Dark Knight trilogy. While Talia al Ghul's death is executed poorly, Bane's is such a massive missed opportunity. This is the man who broke Batman. He forced Bruce to finally reconcile with his past and conquer and accept the fear within him. We did get the incredible final bout between the two, but we were robbed of the true resolution that this story seemed to be building up to. All in all, the Talia reveal ends up feeling unearned, uninteresting, and underwhelming. There's also the issue of Jim Gordon. Admittedly, this is a smaller problem, but I would have liked to see some real resolution for his character. We don't even know for sure where he's at career-wise by the end of the story. When Bane read his letter aloud to the people of Gotham, I figured this meant his actual resignation, but then we see him during the epilogue on the roof of the MCU like nothing ever happened. I would have loved at least one extra scene to give him a proper send-off, because he ended up being one of my favorite characters in the entire trilogy. There's also the issue of the perceived plot holes. To be completely honest, these don't hamper my enjoyment of the movie personally, but I understand how they can be a big deal to some people. There are some logistical issues presented by Bane's occupation of Gotham. There's the issue of Bruce somehow getting back to Gotham in only 23 days. There's also the issue of how exactly he got into Gotham. I know these plot holes really do ruin the movie for some people, but like I said, for me they don't really matter. They can each be explained pretty easily, but it probably would have been better for the film itself to at least attempt an explanation. One complaint this movie gets a lot, however, that I don't agree with, is all the hate aimed at Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, John Blake. Personally, I absolutely love the character, and I found his arc to be one of the most well-developed in the narrative. While I do think that some of the time devoted to him should have been given to Catwoman, what we ended up getting out of his character was well worthwhile to me. His arc shows his growing disillusionment with the police force, with him finally deciding to become a vigilante like Batman, perhaps even becoming this universe's version of Nightwing. This transition is symbolized by a physical change. He first loses the cop uniform when he's promoted to detective. He throws away his gun after accidentally killing someone with it. He loses his police car after Bane's attack on the city. And finally, he throws away his badge after being condemned to die by the military. Overall, I was a big fan of his character, and I disagree with the common notion that he was a waste of time or out of place in this story. If I had to define The Dark Knight Rises in one word, it would be ambitious. It has a ton of good ideas, but unfortunately not all of them stick. After watching Rises when I was a kid, I did not like it at all. Before my first viewing for this video, I decided to write down my thoughts on the film, and I claimed I found it overstuffed, vain, and self-indulgent. After that viewing, there were only small changes in my opinion. I appreciated the movie a lot more from a technical standpoint. The visuals were frankly revolutionary, the practical effects incredible, and the score was one of the best I'd ever heard. Upon second and third viewing for this video though, I gained an appreciation for the narrative. The themes hit home in a way that they never had before. The characters had a depth that I didn't bother to understand previously, and the big action sequences were no longer just typical bombastic superhero moments, but immensely powerful, emotionally resonant set pieces. No, this movie is not a masterpiece, but in the making of this video, I learned to love The Dark Knight Rises. I respect it as the conclusion to the Nolan Batman films, and believe that it also can stand on its own as a landmark title in the superhero genre. I've come to describe it this way. The Dark Knight Rises feels like the second to the last draft of a masterpiece. Nolan was so close to recapturing the magic of The Dark Knight, which should have been impossible, but he just barely missed the mark. The small missteps added up until eventually Rises fell to a level just short of its predecessors. Rises is the worst of the Nolan Batman trilogy, but that doesn't make it a bad movie. I have a newfound appreciation for it, and it's likely a title I'll return to a number of times from now on, which is not something I would have ever said previously. With that, Nolan's time with the Caped Crusader came to a close. He would go on to help kick off the DCEU, DC's initial answer to the MCU, Marvel's cinematic juggernaut. We all know how that ended, but of course, that isn't all he did in the coming years. His godfathering of the upcoming Man of Steel would prove to be nothing more than a footnote in his career compared to what was to come. Just 2 years after The Dark Knight Rises, Nolan would direct yet another original story entitled Interstellar, one of the most widely discussed films of the 2010s, and yet another Nolan project that ranks highly on many people's all-time rankings. That's the next Nolan film I'll be covering, but there's a few other movies I'd like to talk about beforehand. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.